My name is Santiago, and what I'm about to tell you happened a couple of years ago. I don't know if you or your audience will believe me, but honestly, I don't really care. I just need to get this off my chest. For almost 10 years, I worked as a park ranger in a mountainous rural area near a small town in central Mexico. Most days were peaceful and monotonous, and my job was simple: patrol the trails, ensure visitors didn't get lost, and occasionally check for dead animals or signs of poachers. Nothing out of the ordinary, to be honest. However, there was one place that always unsettled me: a ravine a bit off the main paths. It was a spot no one ever went to, not even the locals. At first glance, there seemed to be no reason to avoid it. It was a green, dense area with tall trees and a refreshing breeze that made it seem inviting. But something about the place felt off, and I couldn't quite understand why. The first time I noticed something was wrong was about a year before what I'm about to tell you. During one of my regular patrols, I found a dead goat in that ravine. It was positioned strangely, with clean cuts on its body, and surrounded by what looked like dry branches arranged in a circle. The goat didn't appear to have been attacked by a predator. I thought it might be the work of a poacher, or at worst some strange ritual. I reported it to my superiors, but they didn't take it seriously. They suggested it was probably the work of a bigger animal, or maybe just someone trying to scare others. Throughout that year, I found more dead animals in the same area, some smaller, some larger, always arranged in a similar manner. I started to feel like something or someone was using that ravine for something more than just hunting. The strange arrangement of branches, small piles of stones, and even melted candle remnants suggested something was happening there, and it didn't feel right. But as expected, my superiors dismissed it, saying it was just coincidences. One night around 9 p.m., I decided to patrol the area. Something in my head wouldn't let me rest, like a voice telling me I needed to find out what was really going on there. I had my flashlight, a knife, and my radio in case something went wrong. The air felt colder than usual, and the wind from the mountains whistled through the trees, making the night feel even more unsettling. As I ventured deeper into the ravine, I noticed everything was quieter than usual. There were no crickets or the usual sounds of nocturnal animals, just silence. I reached the end of the ravine where the vegetation was denser and the branches from the trees intertwined above my head, blocking almost all the moonlight. It was there that I saw them. A group of women, all dressed in black, gathered around a small fire that barely illuminated their figures. There weren't many, maybe 5 or 6, but what disturbed me the most was what was in the center of the circle they formed. At first I thought it was a pile of old clothes or some kind of sack, but soon I realized I was wrong. It was a body. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't understand what I was seeing, and part of me screamed that I should leave immediately, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, watching as these women leaned over the corpse, murmuring things I couldn't understand. The one who seemed to be the leader, an old woman with a face full of deep wrinkles, raised her hands and began chanting something in a tone that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't Spanish, that was certain, but the words, though I couldn't comprehend them, had a weight that pressed against my chest. I hid behind a tree, trying not to make a sound, but I knew that if any of them turned their head, they'd spot me. Despite being at a considerable distance, I could clearly see what they were doing. The old woman led a kind of ritual, moving her hands over the body in a meticulous, almost reverent manner. From time to time, one of the other women would lean down to pick something up from the ground, whether dirt, leaves, or what looked like small bones, and place them on the body. My breathing grew heavy, and it was then that one of the women saw me. I don't know how it happened, but as soon as our eyes met, the chanting stopped. The old woman slowly raised her head and locked eyes with me. I'll never forget that gaze. Her eyes were hollow, as if there was no humanity behind them. I felt a pressure in my chest, like my heart was being crushed from the inside. The pain was so intense that I almost collapsed to my knees. I knew I had to leave. I ran as fast as I could, feeling the air grow heavier with every step. As I ascended, I heard their voices behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I don't know if they followed me or if they just let me go, but I made it back to my ranger station, trembling and unable to speak a word. The next morning, I went back with another ranger, but to my surprise, there was no trace of the women or the body. Only the remnants of the fire and some broken branches were left. I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, but I can't forget what I saw, what I felt that night. Since then, I've heard rumors in the town about the witches of the ravine, women who practice black magic and perform rituals in the darkest parts of the forest. I quit my job shortly after that incident. I couldn't continue patrolling those trails, knowing what I had witnessed, Now I live in the city, far from that ravine, but every time I close my eyes I can see them. I don't know why they let me go, but something tells me those women are still out there, conducting their rituals, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of crossing their path. I don't care if you believe me or not. I know what I saw. Witches aren't just some children's tale, they're real and they're closer than we think. My name is Raoul, and even though I've always been a skeptic, what I'm about to share with you still haunts me to this day. I don't expect you to believe me, and I'm not here to convince anyone. I simply want to share something I experienced a few years ago that to this day I still can't fully explain. What I do know is that it completely changed my view of the world. I grew up in a small town in southern Mexico, a place where legends and superstitions were commonly discussed. Since I was a child, I heard the older people talk about a hill on the outskirts of town, a spot everyone avoided. My grandfather in particular used to warn me never to go up there, especially at night. He said that if I did, I would see things that were better left unseen. I remember him telling me that on full moon nights, strange lights could sometimes be seen on top of the hill, and eerie chants would make your skin crawl. According to him, there was something in that place that should not be disturbed, and it was best to stay away. As a curious child, I didn't pay much attention, just another story from the older folks. Years went by and I moved to the city, leaving those tales behind. But about 5 years ago, as an adult with my own family, I returned to the village to visit my mother. My father had passed away recently, and she had been left alone in the house. I planned to stay for a few days to help her out and spend some time with her. Everything seemed normal when I arrived, but I noticed that something was bothering her. She had a German shepherd, a loyal companion for years, and the dog had always been fearless. But recently, especially at night, it started acting strange. It would sit by one of the windows facing the hill, staring intensely and growling, as if it was seeing something I couldn't. My mother also told me something that unsettled me. She said that in the past few weeks, she'd seen an elderly woman lurking near the house, always at night, always watching from a distance. According to her, the woman didn't do anything. She just stood there, smiling in the darkness. My mother thought she might be a wanderer, or someone who had lost her mind, but that smile, her smile, made her nervous. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a confused old woman, but things got worse. One night, the dog began to howl and scratch at the door desperately, as if it wanted to get out. I decided to follow it to see what had gotten it so agitated. The dog ran towards the hill, and although I felt a chill run through me, I followed it. When we reached the top, I hid behind some trees. That's when I saw her, an elderly woman, thin and hunched, dressed in tattered black rags. She was standing near a small fire that barely lit her figure. In her hands she held what looked like a cloth sack. Although I was at a distance, I could hear her murmuring something that sounded like a chant. It was then that I realized she wasn't alone. Around her in the shadows were other women. Their faces were hard to see, but their movements were slow and synchronized, as if they were performing some kind of ritual. My heart began to race, and I crouched lower to avoid being seen. What took my breath away was the sight of an animal's carcass on the ground, surrounded by symbols carved into the earth. These weren't the typical symbols you see in movies. No, these were crude, primitive markings, but they carried a heavy energy that made me feel like I was in a very dangerous place. I tried to back away quietly, but my nerves betrayed me. I stepped on a dry twig and it snapped loudly. The women immediately stopped what they were doing and turned towards me. The old woman was the first to spot me. Her eyes, I'm not sure how to describe them, were lifeless. They were dull, as though she were looking right through me. In that moment, I knew I shouldn't have been there. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, stumbling over rocks and roots as I made my way down the hill. Even though I didn't hear any footsteps, I could feel a presence following me. When I got to the house, the dog was still growling in front of the door, staring at the hill as if it knew something was out there. I locked the door, and without saying a word to my mother, I went to my room. I couldn't sleep all night. The next morning, my mother and I found dead birds arranged in a perfect circle in front of the door. There were several of them. My mother, who had always been a skeptic, couldn't explain what had happened, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The dog, which had been perfectly healthy until then, began to deteriorate rapidly, and within days, it died, despite the veterinarian's best efforts. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, and left the village soon after. But what troubles me the most is that to this day, I still dream about that woman and her empty gaze. Sometimes I feel as though she's still watching me, hidden somewhere, waiting. This isn't a ghost story, nor is it about mythical creatures. What I saw, what I experienced was real. Witches are not characters from children's tales with pointed hats and flying broomsticks. They are real women with flesh and blood, carrying out dark rituals that should remain in the shadows. If you ever hear stories about lights on hills or chants in the night, I suggest you stay far away. Not all legends are just stories. I'm not sure if what I'm about to tell you will sound real or not, but I needed to get this off my chest. This happened just over a year ago when I was living in an apartment building in a fairly central area of the city. It's not the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange to happen, but what I experienced there has left me with a lot of doubts and some fears that I still haven't been able to shake off. When I first moved into the apartment, everything seemed normal. It was a small building with just 5 floors and a couple of apartments on each floor. The neighbors were all pretty quiet, some more than others, but nothing out of the ordinary. I'd been living there for about 6 months when the lady from the apartment across from mine moved out. I never really knew why she left. She just left a note in the mailbox saying she was going to her daughter's house. Nothing strange about that. A few weeks later, a new neighbor moved in. She was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, but what stood out to me from the start was that she never spoke to anyone. I mean, she didn't even greet anyone when passing through the hall or in the elevator. In the building, there was always someone exchanging pleasantries, but not with her. She also hardly ever left during the day. I only ever heard her door open and close late at night when most of the neighbors were already asleep. What seemed odd, and I swear I didn't notice at first, was that every time she came back from one of her late-night outings, there was always a strange, dark dust mark in the hallway right in front of her door. It wasn't just dirt. It was something thicker, almost sticky. It made me uncomfortable, but I tried not to pay too much attention to it. Things started to get stranger when I noticed that every time I saw her or walked past her door, I got a weird chill. I'm not superstitious, but there was something about that woman that sent shivers down my spine. I can't explain it. It was just this feeling of unease. Sometimes at night, while I was watching TV or reading, I would hear noises in the hallway. It wasn't footsteps, more like whispers. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe a neighbor talking on the phone, but the sounds always came from the same direction, her apartment. One night I couldn't sleep. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard her door open. I got up and out of curiosity, I went to the peephole of my door. I don't know what I expected to see, but when I looked, I saw something that still haunts me to this day. She was standing there, dragging a large heavy bag behind her. It was black like thick plastic, and what was most bizarre was that she was leaving a dark trail in the hallway, the same one I had noticed before. My heart started racing, but I couldn't look away. When she opened her door, I caught a glimpse inside her apartment, just for a second. There were candles, lots of candles, all black, and something else on a small table. There were photographs, many photographs, and although it was just a quick glance, I recognized some of the people in them. They were old neighbors, people who had lived in the building but were no longer there. I remember seeing a photo of the lady who had lived in my apartment before her, the one who had moved away with her daughter. I slammed the door shut and my heart was pounding. I thought maybe I was seeing things, it was late or I was tired. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well that night. I dreamt about the neighbor, those photos, and something else. Something I couldn't quite remember when I woke up, but it left a horrible feeling. A couple of days went by with nothing strange happening, and I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then one night, something changed. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard soft knocks at my door. At first I thought I was dreaming, but the knocks repeated, this time more insistent. I got up groggy and went to the door. I don't know why, but I didn't open it. I looked through the peephole and there she was, the neighbor, standing in front of my door. She didn't do anything but stare straight ahead. Her lips moved like she was mumbling something. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but I'm sure it was my name. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but finally the knocking stopped and she left. I didn't open the door, not that night or the following ones, even though she knocked twice more, always at the same time. What disturbed me the most was that every time she did, she left a small mound of dark dust in front of my door. By then, I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. My health began to decline. I felt exhausted all the time, barely able to concentrate at work, and the nightmares continued. In them, she would be standing in front of my door, staring at me with a smile that wasn't normal. It wasn't friendly. It was like she enjoyed my fear. I decided enough was enough. I talked to the landlord and told him I needed to move out as soon as possible, that the place wasn't for me. I left within days. forfeiting the deposit and anything else I might have lost. However, before I left, I set up a camera recording at the entrance to the apartment. I don't know why. I just needed to know what that woman was doing when I wasn't there. When I reviewed the footage, I was left speechless. At 3 a.m., like clockwork, she appeared at my door. This time, she didn't just knock, she stood there, murmuring the same thing she always did. The worst part came after that. With chilling calmness, she reached into her bag, pulled out a small jar, and poured dark powder onto the ground, right in front of my door, then simply left. I don't know what happened in that place or what that woman was really doing, but all I know is that since I left, I haven't stopped dreaming about her. Every night she's there, knocking on my door, waiting for me to open it. I've always been a skeptic, never believing in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. I prefer to think that there's a logical explanation for everything. But after what happened to me last year, I'm not so sure anymore. I had just moved into a small apartment in a medium-sized town, not far from where I grew up. I was coming off a breakup, and honestly, I just wanted some time to be alone. The place wasn't anything special, old, but with its charm, and most importantly, it was within my budget. I rented it without thinking much. From the very first day, I noticed something odd about the apartment, though I didn't pay much attention to it at first. There was a corner in the living room that was always a bit damp. I figured it was a leak or something due to the building's age. It wasn't too noticeable, but no matter how much I cleaned it, the moisture would return. It annoyed me, but not enough to do anything about it. Old apartments always have their quirks, right? At first, everything seemed normal. I unpacked, set my keys and remote on the table, and then I'd find them on the floor near that damp corner. At first, I thought I was just clumsy and knocked them off without noticing, but this kept happening more frequently. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired from work or distracted, but then the sounds started. At first, they were soft, almost like whispers, and they always happened at night when I was watching TV or working on my laptop. They seemed to come from that corner. I thought it was the wind or maybe some external noise, but one night the whispering was clearer. It sounded like someone was speaking softly, but I couldn't make out the words. I got up and checked the window, but everything was shut tight. There was no way the wind could cause that sound. A strange discomfort began to creep over me whenever I passed that corner. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if something was watching me. My instinct told me not to look at that spot too long. I convinced myself that I was just getting paranoid from the nonsense I read online or the horror stories I watched for entertainment. One day when I went outside for a smoke, I saw an elderly man, one of the neighbors from the third floor. I decided to ask him if he knew anything about the apartment or if the building had any weird history. At first, he looked at me with curiosity, but when I mentioned the apartment number, his expression changed. He told me that before I moved in, the place had been empty for almost a year. The last person who lived there was a woman named Olga. He didn't know much about her, but rumors said she was a witch or something like that. No one saw her much. She always kept to herself and rarely talked to the other neighbors. That's when I decided to do a little more research. I didn't find much, but enough to know that Olga had disappeared overnight. One day she just stopped showing up, and no one in the building knew what happened to her. Some people in the neighborhood claimed she performed strange rituals, but no one could confirm anything. It was just gossip from bored folks. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about that corner. The whispering kept going, and even though I tried to ignore it, it became more frequent. The damp spot on the wall had changed. It wasn't just a stain anymore, it seemed to form some sort of pattern. One night I got closer to it, and when I looked more carefully, I noticed the dampness seemed to trace lines, almost like someone had drawn symbols by hand. That's when the nightmares started. They were always the same. In my dreams, I would see a woman standing in that corner. She wouldn't say anything, just stare at me. Her face wasn't entirely visible, but her eyes were the most disturbing part. They were cold, empty, as if they had no soul. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, cold sweat on my skin. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that it was all in my head, but my health began to deteriorate. I was constantly tired, couldn't sleep well, and anxiety started to take over. I stopped inviting friends over because, even though I never told them what was happening, I felt like something was wrong, and I didn't want them to notice. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a spatula and started scraping the wall. Something inside me needed to know what was going on. What I found froze me in place. Beneath the paint, there were carvings. They weren't just random scratches. They were symbols that looked like they came from some other language, almost like part of some ritual. I stood there, frozen, wondering how I hadn't noticed this before. It was as if someone had wanted to seal something behind that layer of paint. At that moment, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just a faint murmur anymore. It sounded like an echo in my head. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if the woman from my nightmares was standing right behind me. I dropped the spatula and backed away. I don't know how I did it, but I ran out of the apartment. The next day I gathered my things as quickly as I could. I didn't care about losing the deposit or anything else. I left the apartment and didn't look back. I don't know what really happened in that place, but I know I wasn't alone. Something or someone was still there. And those were today's stories. Did you like any of them? Comment on which one you liked and tell us if you've ever experienced something like this in your life. Don't forget to like, and I hope to see you in the next video, if you have the courage to watch more stories.